February 1991. An Iraqi T-72 tank commander peers through his optical sight across the Kuwaiti desert. His crew is confident. Their tank had been sold to them as a match for anything the Americans could field. Then, without warning, his world ends in a flash of white heat. 3 kilometers away, an M1 Abrams crew is already traversing to their next target. This scene repeated itself hundreds of times during Operation Desert Storm, and it shattered every assumption the Soviet Union had made about armored warfare. For decades, Soviet tankers and their military planners had laughed at American tank design. Too expensive, too complex, too slow to produce. The Americans were building boutique weapons while the Soviets churned out an army. But when the M1 Abrams finally met the T-72 in combat, the laughter died at 3,000 meters. The story begins not in the desert, but in the corridors of Soviet tank design bureaus during the Cold War. The philosophy was simple and brutal. Quantity has a quality all its own. The T-72, introduced in 1973, embodied this doctrine perfectly. It was compact, measuring just over 9 meters long compared to the Abrams' nearly 10 meters. It was simple, designed to be operated by conscripts with minimal training, and most importantly, it was cheap enough to mass produce. By 1991, over 25,000 T-72s had rolled off Soviet production lines. Soviet engineers built the T-72 around lessons learned from the great tank battles of World War II, particularly Kursk, where waves of Soviet armor had overwhelmed German defenses through sheer numbers. The design reflected a cold calculation. Tanks would be lost, crews would die, but the force that could replace losses fastest would win. The T-72's autoloader carousel, storing ammunition in a ring around the turret base inside the crew compartment, was celebrated as a breakthrough that reduced crew size from 4 to 3 men. Soviet planners saw efficiency. They missed the fatal vulnerability. When American intelligence reports about the M1 Abrams reached Moscow in the early 1980s, Soviet analysts were dismissive. The Americans had built a tank powered by a turbine engine that guzzled fuel. It cost $3 million per unit when a T-72 cost a fraction of that. It required sophisticated maintenance and highly trained crews. The Americans, Soviet thinking went, had built themselves into a corner. They could never produce enough Abrams tanks to matter. For every M1 the Americans fielded, the Soviets would field 10 T-72s. The math seemed unbeatable. But the Americans weren't playing the same game. The M1 Abrams represented a fundamental shift in armored warfare philosophy. For the first time in tank design history, crew survivability was the primary requirement, not an afterthought. The Abrams featured blowout panels in the ammunition storage areas. If the tank was hit and ammunition cooked off, the explosion vented upward and outward, away from the crew compartment. Soviet designers had never considered this necessary. Crews were replaceable. Tanks were replaceable. Everything was replaceable. The technological gap went far deeper than armor protection. The M1 Abrams integrated systems that Soviet engineers were still struggling to develop. Its fire control system combined a laser rangefinder, ballistic computer, and sensors that measured wind, temperature, barrel wear, and ammunition type. The gunner simply put the crosshairs on target, and the computer calculated the firing solution. Meanwhile, the T-72 relied on optical range finding and manual calculations. The Soviet gunner had to estimate range, adjust for conditions, and hope his training was sufficient. Even more critical was the thermal imaging sight. The M1's gunner could see heat signatures through darkness, smoke, and the sandstorms that plagued desert warfare. The T-72's optical sights were excellent for their time, but they required visible light or active infrared searchlights that betrayed the tank's position. In technical terms, the Abrams could see 2 to 3 times farther than the T-72 in daylight, and infinitely farther at night or in obscured conditions. This wasn't just an advantage, it was a revolution. The gun stabilization system completed the Abrams' dominance. Soviet tanks could fire on the move, but accuracy dropped dramatically. American tank crews trained to engage targets at full speed, and the M1 stabilization system kept the gun on target regardless of terrain. In practice, this meant an Abrams could charge across broken ground at 40 miles per hour and still place rounds on target at 3,000 meters. A T-72 had to slow down or stop to shoot accurately. When Iraq invaded Kuwait in August 1990, Saddam Hussein commanded the world's fourth-largest army, built almost entirely on Soviet equipment and doctrine. His armored forces included over 2,000 T-72s, the most modern variant the Soviets exported. Soviet advisors had trained Iraqi crews. Soviet doctrine guided Iraqi tactics. When coalition forces began assembling in Saudi Arabia, Iraqi tank commanders were confident. They had numbers, defensive positions, and proven Soviet technology. The air war began on January 17, 1991, and it revealed the first cracks in Soviet military technology. Iraqi air defenses, built entirely on Soviet systems, proved nearly helpless against American stealth aircraft and electronic warfare. But the real shock came when the ground war started on February 24th. What Iraqi commanders expected to be a grinding battle of attrition turned into a massacre. The Battle of 73 Easting on February 26th became the definitive demonstration of the Abrams' superiority. The 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, equipped with M1 Abrams tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles, pushed into Iraqi positions during a sandstorm. Visibility was measured in meters. Iraqi T-72s were dug into defensive positions, hull down, waiting. Under Soviet doctrine, this should have been ideal, defending forces with prepared positions against attacking forces moving through difficult conditions. Instead, American thermal sights cut through the sandstorm as if it didn't exist. Iraqi tanks appeared on Abrams gunners' screens as bright white shapes against the cold desert. The Americans opened fire at ranges exceeding 3,000 meters. Iraqi crews never saw their attackers. The first indication of American presence was when their tanks exploded around them. In some cases, Iraqi tankers attempted to return fire in the general direction of incoming rounds, shooting blindly into the storm. Their rounds fell short or sailed past, unaimed and ineffective. The ammunition stored in the T-72's carousel proved catastrophic. When an M1's depleted uranium sabot round penetrated the T-72's armor, it ignited the ammunition stored around the crew. The resulting explosion was so violent that turrets weighing several tons were thrown clear of the hull, sometimes landing dozens of meters away. American soldiers called it the jack-in-the-box effect. Soviet designers had created a death trap. Of the hundreds of T-72s engaged during Desert Storm, almost none survived a direct hit. The crews had no chance. The Battle of Norfolk the following day reinforced the pattern. The American 1st Infantry Division engaged the Iraqi Republican Guard's Tawakalna Division. Again, Abrams tanks destroyed T-72s at extreme range. Iraqi return fire was sparse and ineffective. When Iraqi tanks did manage to hit American armor, the results were shocking to both sides. M1 Abrams tanks took multiple hits and kept fighting. The combination of Chaubum composite armor and depleted uranium mesh defeated Iraqi rounds. Crews reported feeling the impact, but penetrations were rare. When M1 tanks were disabled, it was usually by mobility kills or engine damage, not crew casualties. The statistics from Desert Storm tell a stark story. The coalition lost approximately 20 M1 Abrams tanks during the entire campaign. Not one was destroyed by enemy tank fire. Most losses came from friendly fire, landmines, or deliberate scuttling of damaged vehicles. In contrast, coalition forces destroyed over 2,000 Iraqi tanks, the vast majority being T-72s. The kill ratio was so lopsided that military analysts initially questioned the reports. This couldn't be real, but it was. The key to understanding this massacre lies in a concept American strategist John Boyd called the OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, act. The side that cycles through these steps faster than their opponent gains an insurmountable advantage. The M1 Abrams was designed as a complete system to dominate every phase of this cycle. Its thermal sights observed the enemy first. Its fire control system oriented and provided targeting solutions instantly. Its ergonomic crew layout and training allowed rapid decisions. Its stabilized gun and superior ammunition allowed immediate, accurate action. The T-72, despite being a capable tank by 1970s standards, couldn't compete in any phase. It observed late or not at all. Its manual systems required time to orient and calculate. Decisions were hampered by limited information. Actions were less accurate and slower. By the time a T-72 crew completed one UTA cycle, an Abrams crew had completed 3 or 4. The Iraqi tankers were fighting a battle that was already over before they knew it had begun. Soviet military observers in Iraq sent frantic reports to Moscow. The assessments were devastating. Soviet armor doctrine, refined over decades and validated in World War II, had been rendered obsolete. The technological gap wasn't incremental, it was generational. American tanks weren't just better, they operated in a different dimension of warfare. They saw in the dark, they hit targets beyond the horizon, they shrugged off hits that should have been lethal. And perhaps most disturbing to Soviet planners, American crews survived. The implications extended far beyond tank design. If Soviet armor was this outmatched, what about Soviet aircraft, artillery, infantry fighting vehicles? The entire Soviet military-industrial complex had been built on the assumption that Western technology was expensive, but not decisively superior. Desert Storm shattered that assumption. The Soviet Union, already staggering economically, faced the reality that its military could not compete with NATO in conventional warfare. Some historians argue that the performance gap revealed in Kuwait contributed to the final collapse of Soviet confidence in their system. Russia and other former Soviet states spent the following decades trying to close the gap. The T-90, introduced in the early 1990s, incorporated some lessons from Desert Storm: better fire control, improved armor, and relocated ammunition storage. The T-14 Armata, unveiled in 2015, represents an even more radical redesign with an unmanned turret and crew capsule. But these developments came too late and in too few numbers. The fundamental lesson had been learned. Modern armored warfare is won by the side that sees first and shoots first, not by the side with more tanks. The M1 Abrams, meanwhile, continues to serve 40 years after its introduction. It has been continuously upgraded with better armor, improved electronics, and more powerful ammunition. The basic platform proved so sound that no replacement has been necessary. Tanks that fought in Desert Storm, upgraded multiple times, fought again in Iraq in 2003, and variants remain in service today. The design philosophy that Soviet planners mocked as too expensive and too complex has proven to be exactly right. Build systems that keep crews alive, give them overwhelming information advantage, and invest in platforms that can evolve. The story ends where it began, in the desert at 3,000 meters where confidence met reality. Soviet tankers had laughed at American design choices, secure in their numerical superiority and historical precedent. But when the shooting started, those laughs echoed in empty T-72 hulls scattered across Kuwait. The Americans had rewritten the rules of armored warfare, and everyone else was still playing the old game. In the end, it wasn't even close. If you found this story fascinating, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our next deep dive into military history. Drop a like if you enjoyed it, and let me know in the comments, what other Cold War weapon systems should we analyze? Your support keeps this channel going. Thanks for watching.